We're live. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Women Who Rock Investigates. And this is your host, Ms. Diane Winbush, coming to you live. This is our first video that we're having with the investigation case study channel, and we are delighted to bring this forward to you. So today we have an exceptional guest in the studio with us, and it is none other than special case victim, State Prosecutor Kathryn Marsh. And so she is going to be with us today. We're going to be talking about some topics in regards to intimate partner and domestic violence. So welcome to the platform, Kathryn. This is her second time also, ladies and gentlemen, that she is with us, and she's going to be with us in the month of April if her schedule permits it. So good morning and welcome, Kathryn.
Good morning, Diane. Thank you so much for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to be the first video.
Yes, you are, and we are honored to have you. So tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started with the actual topics itself.
Absolutely. So as one of my day jobs, I am a special victims prosecutor, and for the last 12 years, I have been specialized in domestic violence or intimate partner violence, child abuse, and sexual assault cases. In addition to that, with my co-founder, Melissa Hotmeyer, we have Right Response Consulting, which is an organization that trains law enforcement, communities, universities on child abuse, teen dating violence, human trafficking, trauma-informed investigations, and our No Gray Zone podcast, which deals specifically with those topics and helping our community understand the signs and symptoms of intimate partner violence, of child abuse, what to look for, and then what to do if they or a loved one are in that position.
Okay, so how long have you worked in this field, and what was your actual passion that kind of drove you to wanting to be in this this sensitive occupation?
So, I actually started right after college as a victim witness coordinator for the local prosecutor's office that I lived in that jurisdiction when I graduated college. And the broad majority of the cases I started with were actually intimate partner violence cases. So I would work with victims to get protective orders. In other jurisdictions, they're called restraining orders, and then help them through the court process and if there were criminal charges. So that's kind of how I started. And then when I became a lawyer and a prosecutor, child abuse was really my main focus and passion. But with the field of domestic violence, all aspects of the family come in. And we know so often if there's child abuse, there's often intimate partner violence. And just like that, there can also be stalking or sexual violence also in the home. So very often they go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, that's good. So we're gonna first we're gonna talk about the original format. It's two, but we're gonna learn both of them. One is the domestic violence, and then we're gonna learn about the intimate partner. So share with us a little bit to define domestic violence and what is it, and then two, we want to talk about some examples of domestic violence. As we shared before we went live, sometimes individuals will file report claims against their significant other or against someone that's on the job or someone that's in their community, and they may not have the actual terminology and the definition accurate as to what they are filing. So share with us a little bit about the meaning of domestic violence.
Absolutely. So domestic violence, often traditionally, people think of that as violence between two partners, spouses, dating couples. What we have found in the criminal law, and every jurisdiction is a little different with their definitions, but that domestic violence was being used broadly to cover all kinds of violence that fall within a domestic setting. So it can be parents and children, it can be siblings, and it can be spouses or partners. And so domestic violence became an umbrella term that covered all violence within that domestic family household setting. And because of that, in recent years, we've discovered in order to properly address certain problems and issues, we needed to redefine. And so we now have intimate partner violence, which and many times still on, TV shows and movies, domestic violence is still what we in the legal field call intimate partner violence, which is violence between partners, romantic partners, spouses, and that's any gender makeup, however somebody's in an intimate romantic partner relationship.
Okay, and so even with some examples, so before we went live, we were talking about the two couples, the husband and the wife, and I was visiting a friend some years ago, and so after we kind of peeked outside, me and my other friend, and we peeked outside, and we saw that the husband was being brought out on the stretcher in this domestic violence situation. And the wife is the one actually taken out in the handcuffs. And so what are your statistics as to the ratio of men being the ones that are the victim in the United States?
That's a great question, Diane, because I think so often we break down the stereotype of it's always the woman who's being abused. And that's truly not the case, because statistically, 1 in 7 men are the victims of intimate partner violence. And that's severe physical partner violence. Now compare it to women, it's 1 in 4, but 1 in 7 is a much higher statistic than most people would think of for men being victimized. It's also a lot harder for a man to come forward, because oftentimes they feel that they won't be believed if I'm the man being abused by my wife, or even if you're being abused by a male partner, oftentimes they feel they won't be believed, or they'll be belittled sometimes in the reports. And so it's really important that we make sure people understand that intimate partner violence is anybody who is in that intimate romantic relationship can be a victim, and everybody has the right to seek help or to come forward. And that's just what, we need to make sure we get out there.
Okay. So we want to talk about some components of domestic violence. And so one of them, we want to be able to touch on the subject of stalking. Stalking is very, very difficult to prove. Sometimes women go into a deep depression because they feel like they're not believed by law enforcement. Sometimes there are gray areas in the law as to how stalking can be identified, which can run an individual crazy. So let's talk about stalking and what type of stalking is domestic violence. I went through some things, and I think it was under the pattern, and we're going to get into that in a little bit later on in the show. But I actually went through something through the workforce, and it's just, I was not believed. So we want to talk about how women, a lot of actresses have went through this, where they have went to the law, and you would think that the law will believe an actress before they believe someone that's on a urban culture or a low income status. Sometimes low income status individuals are very non-believable because the statistic rates are so high in domestic violence and stalking. So share with us what stalking actually is and some of the components up under stalking.
Absolutely. Stalking is extremely difficult in the criminal law field to prove. One, because as prosecutors, I can tell you, our laws are not well written to try to prove a stalking case. But statistically across the country, 1 in 7 women and 1 in 18 men have been stalked by an intimate partner. And when we're looking at the field of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, it's important that we understand all kinds of abuse that can happen. Oftentimes you will hear the power and abuse wheel that experts will talk about. And under that can be the physical abuse. It can be emotional abuse. It can be economic abuse of one partner controlling the money so that the person who is the victim doesn't have the ability to leave. They don't have access to their bank card or to a vehicle, or they can't take their kids to a doctor without permission. And so they're stuck in a situation through economic abuse. There can be psychological abuse, and oftentimes stalking can fall under that psychological abuse of I will know where you are, wherever you are. And you can have all of that. And So you've got that whole power and control dynamic wheel, and there's all different components of intimate partner violence that fall in it. Some of the ones we can prosecute criminally. Some we can't. A lot of times economic abuse isn't going to fall under a criminal law, but I know you're going to speak to a family law attorney later on this subject, and a lot of that can be handled in those ways. And a lot of times our laws, our criminal laws, quite frankly, are still catching up with society. You know, if you think back, just go back 40, 50 years, domestic violence, that was something that stayed in the home and that you dealt with as a family. And you weren't to come forward and you weren't to get outside help. And so when I look at our statistics now, and when we talk about how prevalent it is, and I think when we look at 24 Americans or 24 people in this country are abused in an intimate partner violence every minute, and it's 12 million people in this country every year. Domestic violence is its own pandemic all the time. But when we look at those numbers, I take the silver lining of we're at least getting those reports now. We're at least letting that come outside of that family home and be talked about. And so that's why I said our laws are still catching up a lot of ways to where we are now as a society. And stalking is often extremely hard to prove because how do you show somebody was necessarily following behind you in a car unless you take a picture? How do you necessarily show that when you see somebody walking by, but if you can't catch them on a surveillance camera, how do you prove that person was walking by your work window? It's extremely difficult. Now, I have to say, we have been amazed at some tech companies who have truly come up with ways to help victims and survivors. One is Victim's Voice, and I recommend everybody going and checking out their site. It's a web-based app, so you don't actually ever have something like an app on your phone that somebody could see the icon for. It's web-based, so you would just go in and it makes a geolocation tag and a timestamp, date stamp of wherever you go in. So if you are at work and you see the person walk by your window, you can immediately go in and be like, they walked by my window, and it's a geolocation tag on that and a date, time, and stamp. You can snap a picture if they're behind you in the car and it automatically uploads. And then Victim's Voice actually can print out an entire certified report that can be admitted in a court now. It's past the Daubert standard, which is a scientific standard, and has been admitted into trials. So we have that now. There's a great app called You Are Safe as well, that they have one version where you have to hit the keys and go on, and they have another version if people want to pay for it that's voice activated with a command that somebody can say their safe word, and it automatically starts audio and video recording everything, and it uploads it to who you pick as your safety person, and it's uploading to the cloud. So now victims have a way of getting in real time hard evidence that can be used, so we can actually start fixing some of these cases with stalking and with intimate partner violence, where before, you know, it's the overused expression, he said, she said, because injuries and without hard proof, how do you prove some of them? And like I said, our tech companies and some of these apps have been amazing in truly finding ways to give our victims a voice and some extra security.
Okay, so would you say or recommend that would be a way that women, or whether it's men, can be a way to be able to protect themselves, as to
Absolutely.
have these apps available where it's there, and then can somewhat have some sort of proof, which is going to lead to my next question, and it's in regards to sexual harassment. And so, of course, we're not here to be a political voice, but of course the situation is going on with the governor in New York as of right now. You know, in some ways I sympathize with him because he apologized and things, but there are so many women now that are coming out of the woodwork, and they have been wounded, they have been offended. So what do we do with all of those feelings? So why does it take one person to get the ball rolling, and then the other ones will come out of the nest egg and begin to report such crimes that people have committed and have probably have held for so long?
I think, Diane, you raised it earlier in our conversation when you said there was the whole concern about will I be believed? And when somebody makes a report, they're not believed. And I think that's a real issue and a concern that we have. The End Violence Against Women International Organization actually just this week, they celebrated their 10th anniversary of their campaign of Start with Belief. And, you know, they've trained internationally to get law enforcement to work with employers of, you start with the premise of the belief in the allegation, and then you do the investigation and you look for all the evidence. And it's not, I'm going to believe them no matter what, but it's, you start with, they've made a report, I'm going to believe it, and now I'm going to investigate. And if the evidence can get me there, then we can charge criminally. And if the evidence can't, we won't. But, you know, I compare that so often. Think about an armed robbery case or a burglary case. If a victim reports a burglary at their home and the police respond out, we never once say, you know, well, prove you had that necklace or prove you had that TV before I take a report. It's, I've responded to your home. You've told me it's been broken into and these things are missing. And I'm going to take this report and I'm going to believe that report. But for some reason, we treat victims of sexual assault and harassment and intimate partner violence differently. And we don't, we've gotten a lot better. I do have to say, we've gotten a lot better. But, you know, that's why there's been a 10-year campaign of Start with Belief, because our victims deserve to be met with belief when they're asking for help.
Exactly.
You know, you raise sexual harassment, and so often sexual harassment doesn't fall under a criminal statute. It's dealt with through the civil realms or through human resources.
Okay.
But, you know, the Women's Law Center put out a journal, the whole article last year, that indicated how many times, like it was over 60%. It was actually heartbreaking, of either gender who reports sexual harassment, either nothing's done or they feel they're the ones punished for making the report. And, you know, we need to make improvements across the board in how do we handle reports of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct. Universities have Title IX. So if there's sexual harassment, students or staff can make a report under Title IX. You may have heard just this week, President Biden did a new executive order on Title IX, and they're going to start working on changing some of the rules on that, because again, we recognize our laws are not caught up to where they need to be.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree. And so it's like, it's I guess you can't shift the blame on the law. It's just certain people, you know, it's just, you know, it's catching up in some things that have been, you know, basically delayed. So this is a challenge question, Kathryn. It's a challenge question. It may not be in the fall of under the topic, but it's a challenge question. It may. So take the movie that Lori Loughlin played in some years ago called Abandoned. And so it's a true story where this mother had went through some issues and she got a divorce with her significant other, and there was 2 children that were left behind. So Laura Loughlin was the mother that played in this movie, and so she went to go file for some government assistance. No one would help her. The divorced husband was well off, but the parents would not. His parents wouldn't step in and help. He wouldn't step in and help. Come to find out, after she submitted it over and over and over, the person at the office where she filed for this assistance, you know, for child support and all of it, he was going through the same thing with his wife. So he held back her document. This is true. This is a true story. And it comes on Lifetime sometimes as well. He held back. And then of course she went in there and she had to go through a lot of steps. She had to go through a lot of issues and what have you to get him removed. And even she had to go get before the judge. The judge kind of wiggled and twisted, you know, back and forth with her too. So I wanted to kind of add that for for the audience to see if that is something that would be compelling under that type of topic. Would that be a form of some type of when you restrain a person that way? This man went in there and literally restrained this mother from being able to have access to food stamps, having access to welfare, and also having access to her children's child support. He wouldn't go and find the father. He made her do everything. She had to find his social, well, she probably knew his social security number, but she had to go in there and dig it all up. And after she went in there and worked hard and dug up all that information, he still hid it. The only way she found out about it, that he had done that, is that the secretary in that state's office had went in there and dug into his office, his desk, and found that the paperwork had not 6 months and it hadn't went anywhere. So I just wanted to kind of maybe touch on that. That may be a form of it, it may not, but I just wanted to bring it up to just to ask in case for those that may be going through issues with child support and that type of, I mean, I felt that was abuse the way he treated her, you know?
Right. So that wouldn't fall under the intimate partner violence just because the person didn't have the intimate relationship with the mom.
Oh, okay.
And it wouldn't fall under that. And it's such an interesting question. I haven't heard that before. I can't think off the top of my head of a criminal law that would fall under. Clearly, that would be violations of policy. I'm sure that would trigger some civil issues as well. Now, I will say, in just the years that I've been a prosecutor, there have been tremendous gains in how we look at child support, how we look at providing emergency maintenance in situations and things like that. So now most jurisdictions, when somebody applies for their emergency restraining order or their peace order, there's an area right there where they can check and ask for emergency maintenance from the judge, and it's a court order. So, they're not even going through that next step yet. And, they've got to say, look, I am in a violent situation where I or my children are at risk. I need this person out of my home, but I also know I can't maintain the bills and I can't maintain my children's standard of living unless this person I need gone contributes. And so most restraining orders now allow for that emergency maintenance. And again, that hasn't always been around. The more we talk, the more we learn about it, the more changes we make to our laws, which is what we always need. Right. And so that there's emergency maintenance now. I will say that the WIC assistance programs and what used to be called food stamps and things like that are much better, and they're based on children's needs. The courts are always told to look at the best interest of the child. And so those have made vast improvements in just the last 10, 15 years in being able to get resources for children. I mean, you're always going to hear the stories of deadbeat parents who don't pay the child support that they're ordered to pay. And that's a whole separate field of law. And there's all kinds of penalties that happen for the parents who do not pay what they're ordered to pay. But there are a lot more resources now. I mean, think the SNAP program for children to get meals and things. We've made vast improvements with regard to support for families.
Okay, great. At least that would be, it's just, I don't know, it just came up, and it's an old movie back in the early 90s or mid 90s or what have you. But at the end, she triumphed over it all because she was able to also bring attention to the judge. I think they protest the judge, and she started her own organization from the movie and from the challenges that she went through with the husband. And at the end, somehow her and the ex-husband, they were able to iron out some differences, in regards to her speaking out. So I just kind of wanted to touch on that. We're going to go to the next segment, and we want to talk about the LGBTQ community, as well as how domestic violence plays a big part. Here in Tennessee, we saw a news segment where this guy was beat to he was beat senseless. And it's a hate crime on one part, but sometimes with intimate partnership, sometimes that will be more prevalent in the home as well, where we see a lot of abuse that is going on kind of half and half, as well as with male and male and male and female. So we want to talk about a little bit about that and stuff, and then as to the statistics as to how that is rising today in America.
Absolutely. I think we've all recognized over the last several years how much our LGBTQ plus community has been marginalized. They've been marginalized by the laws that they have on their behalf and how people enforce the laws. And so changes have been made, and we still have a ways to go. But when we look at statistics on intimate partner violence, 43.8% of lesbian women and 61.1% of bisexual women have indicated that they have been victims of rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. Compare that to, on average, 35% of heterosexual women. And so the amount of abuse in an LGBTQ plus community for intimate partner violence is much higher than in the heterosexual community. In part, again, let's start with belief. Let's go with what resources have they had available historically, and how have some of them been treated before. Now, when we go back to the power and control dynamic I talked about earlier, in LGBTQ plus communities, there's another aspect, because if one person in that partner isn't ready to be out to everybody yet, you have a power dynamic that gets on. If you leave, I'll out you to everybody else, even if you're not ready to. There's a whole nother form of abuse that can happen within that power and control dynamic that's different for the LGBTQ plus community. And so we need to make sure that our LGBTQ plus community is embraced by law enforcement, by family justice centers, by service providers, and that they know any victim of intimate partner violence, I don't care what race you are, what gender, what nationality, you're going to be able to get the same resources and benefit of any other victim of intimate partner violence.
Oh, wow. So even with the male on male, because I mean, which one is the one that the system identifies as the male? I mean, you have to respect everyone in their own right. Today, they have fought for the equality of their rights and things. So when it comes down to the law, which one is the most dominant that the court respects? Is it the male that's the actual male, or it's the female that is saying that she's a male?
Well, so the transgender community, there's different aspects with regard to that as well. And I mean, there's recently been some studies just on how transgender community is being treated unfairly when it comes to incarceration. And I think we need to look a lot more into that. But when we look at intimate partner violence and to prosecute them and investigate them correctly, what we need to be looking at is for who is the primary aggressor. And we don't put on, it can be a male, it can be a female, and it doesn't matter. What we need to establish is who can be the primary aggressor, who started or instigated the higher threat level of violence. One of the cases that one of the captains that I've trained with for years on intimate partner violence always cites to new detectives who are coming through is a case he rolled up on the scene for. It comes out as a 911. The husband is who calls 911 saying, my wife's out of control. Police roll up. He's bleeding from his head. He has a gash, and wife's immediately put in handcuffs. And this captain, he goes in and he notices, hey, like the furniture's kind of messed up in a way that doesn't make sense with this story. And he goes and interviews the wife. And what he learns is that the wife was being strangled against the wall, which is why the hutch and everything had gotten moved out. And the one thing she could grab as she's being held against the wall is a glass vase that she breaks over his head, which is what allowed her to be dropped and to be free. But so the police, husband's the one who calls, they come up, he's the one bleeding. And so they immediately put the wife in handcuffs, and she was darker complected. So on immediate scene, you're not seeing red marks or swelling to her neck right away. It's only after she's taken to the hospital and has a strangulation exam that you can see, underneath. And so again, the role, it doesn't matter if it's the male, it doesn't matter if the female. What we need to do proper investigation and proper prosecution is who is the primary aggressor, raise the level of that threat violence. Sometimes it might be a woman, sometimes it might be a man. Again, statistics, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men. And so anybody can be the primary aggressor, but we're failing on our end, on the criminal end, if we don't do our due diligence to try to figure that out.
Mhm, mhm. Absolutely. Just kind of just wondering about that, which one would be charged with aggressive, because a lot of times we look at the man as being the one that's the strongest, but I guess you could not be judgmental on that part. You just have to be able to charge the individual according to who is the one that started the trouble. Wow. So let's
Or raise the threat level. Okay, because sometimes there can be joint pushing back and forth in an argument, but they grab the knife and they raise the threat level. At that point, they need to be charged in a way different than a mutual pushing back and forth.
Right. Okay. So are there any type of, do you see in your field, do you see a lot of advocacy advocating going on for that in regards to the LGBT? Because I know we have here in Memphis, Tennessee, there is a lot of advocating. This organization will come out of the woodwork if it's something that is violating anybody, whether it's marriage or whether or what have you, or it's a dating or something like that, or it's stalking. They will raise the level of awareness that they need to raise with the law enforcement and with the public, so they can know that, hey, we're here, we're human, we want to be treated right. And even if it's a domestic, they still do not obscure it. They will come out of the woodwork on it.
Absolutely. I'm fortunate. I live in a suburb outside of DC. And so advocacy outside of DC, it's a way of life. But because it's advocated and because it's vocal, it doesn't mean changes still don't need to be made. Okay. And people should never stop advocating just because some laws have been changed. For example, this year in my state, our legislative session is still going on, but they just added gender identity to our hate crime statute. It hadn't been in our hate crime statute before. We had based on sexuality, so for if somebody had committed a crime just because somebody is gay, that had been part of our hate crime statute, but we didn't have gender identity. And you would think, like, why didn't we have that? It was a loophole that we had missed in our law. And advocacy and putting it forward got that added in this year. And it was one of those things going, absolutely, gender identity should be part of our hate crime statute. If somebody is being harmed criminally for no other reason than their gender identity or their sexual preference, they need to be protected just like any other specialized class in our society. So advocacy is what changes laws, right? If we don't have people willing to speak up and speak out, we're never going to get our criminal laws to match where our society is now. And we're never going to be able to get our civil laws and protections for any person to be where they should be if we don't have people advocating. Like the story you gave of Abandoned, she was able to advocate and started her own, victim service provider because of that.
Absolutely. I know Nancy Grace, that's another one that I love to watch. And so, of course, she was a HLN reporter, and I think a CNN commentator, and I think now she has her own podcast, Crime Online, and she is very, very vocal when it comes to domestic violence. She will post things on all of her social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, and so, I want to, put a shout out to her. And Ellen is also another big advocate for the LGBTQ community. It was some things that happened here in our local area where it was some domestic issues that were going on. And I think it was some things, and this may not play a part, but I feel that emotional factors is a domestic issue as well. And I think it came up about this high school individual could not be able to attend her prom. So she was very, very emotionally affected and what have you, which caused a lot of stalking to, and a lot of things to come up against her. And Ellen just come out of the woodwork and came and rescued this woman, out of nowhere. So I think that it's important too when actors and individuals on higher platforms to get involved for those that may not have a voice on the lower platform, or I don't know, urban communities, I guess I would say that, and what have you, when they feel that their voices are not heard, these stars, they'll come out of nowhere and they'll advocate for it, you know, and I think that's important.
I agree. You know, I am a huge proponent of educate and advocate. I think everybody needs to educate themselves on the problems. I think one thing is, you know, so often, again, we still have the mentality, even though we've gotten so much better, that intimate partner violence or domestic violence is a family problem. And although I said, you know, it's 12 million people in this country every year are a victim of, you know, intimate partner violence, I think what's important is to understand the impact on the community. And sometimes people need it broken down to the dollars and cents, right? So the CDC reports that the lifetime economic costs associated when you go to medical services for intimate partner violence, lost productivity from work, criminal justice system, losses for employers, $3.6 trillion. You know, we're all upset about a $1.9 trillion, you know, economic relief package. Intimate partner violence costs this country $3.6 trillion. When you look at a victim's lifetime, the economic cost to a victim is $103,767, the economic cost to a victim. So this is something that impacts every single part of our community, our employers, our, you know, the whole economic process, our medical community, our ability to provide proper medical treatment. And it's something all of us need to be a part of the solution, because all of us are better when families are healthier. And we need to make sure we're aware of the full dynamic of the problem and what all of us can do to help.
Absolutely. And still going back some years ago, which was in Shelby County, Memphis, Tennessee, there was a huge fallout about a lot of rape kits that were not tested. And since that made me think of it when you brought up the dollar amount of how much it cost. You know, these women were stopped, these women were violated, some of them beaten, some of them died, and they allowed, and I think it was a financial issue as to the reason why those rape kits sat there for according to the statistics, it sat there for years before. And I think now they are still, even like 5 or 6 years later, they are still testing it because it costs so much money. But just think about those women that had to go through all of that pain, all of that process, nobody listening, nobody tested any rape kits or anything like that. And they just had to go on, they had to bury their emotions. They had to bury these emotions. And like I said, I think it happened, this is 2021. I think it was maybe like 2017, 15, that they really actually got around to testing them. It was like, I don't know how many thousands of rape kits, but just think about all of those wounds that it opened back up to those women.
Yeah, it's a nationwide problem. We all across the country had to pass laws with regard to the rape kit backlog. I think my jurisdiction, my state had like 20,000 backlogged, and, you know, but it was an issue that had to be addressed. And but for advocacy, we would probably still have thousands and thousands and thousands of backlogs. But one of the things that we noticed with regard to, as these kits have been tested and are getting hits, is we've discovered a lot more serial rapists than any of us knew, because, you know, we're getting CODIS hits now because the DNA is already in the system from another rape kit. And you can go now online and you can see the statistics of how prevalent, you know, serial rapists are. And for a lot of it, we didn't know because we didn't have all the evidence at the point in time.
Right.
But we mentioned, you know, a lot of times women are killed as well. I think one of the things that we need to recognize with intimate partner violence is that 1 in 5 homicide victims are killed by an intimate partner. And so when we look at homicide across in this country, we're looking at 1 in 5, and half of all of our female homicide victims are killed by a current or former male intimate partner. Wow. So when we look at women who are murdered across this country every year, half of them are by a former intimate male partner.
Okay,
And
okay.
Diane, I know I talked to you before we started live during the week of the issue of strangulation.
Mhm.
And strangulation is another one that we are catching up on with the law. My state just made it a felony just last year. Ohio is trying to pass it this year in their state. Victims of intimate partner violence strangulation are 750 times more likely to end up as the victim of intimate partner homicide than any other crime of intimate partner violence. So when you look at the lethality of strangulation, it's 750 times. And only 3% on average of victims of strangulation go and get medical treatment. And what we know is that a single incident of strangulation can cause stroke, uh, brain damage, organ failure, days, weeks, and months after the strangulation event. And so just getting the community to talk about strangulation, to start talking about how prevalent it is to, one, use the term strangulation as opposed to choking, so we respond appropriately, but to make sure that we are talking in our community, we are talking to our friends and loved ones, that if they have been strangled, we need them to go get medical treatment. We need to make sure that there's not damage to their arteries or their veins or a clot or something that does create serious long-term damage or death even months after the event. And like I said, that's one more thing, right? Where our laws are catching up with the science and the medical science and what we're learning now. There's a Strangulation Institute. You can just look it up online. That's amazing. And, you know, there's a great prosecutor, Kelsey McKay, former prosecutor out of Texas, who has just created an entire expertise on strangulation and asphyxiation because of the prevalence we've discovered this problem is. And, you know, as lawyers, when we stop and we listen to the doctors and the medical science, we realize we need to change our laws to fit the harm. And like I said, my state just became a felony last year. Ohio, they're trying to get it passed this year. You know, so again, it always takes the law a little bit longer to catch up with the community and medical science, but it's important for people to understand the true dangers of strangulation.
Okay, okay, so because that's interesting in what you said, I never would have thought about that. You stated that even if a person is if they survive after, it's still important for them to go and get themselves checked out by a medical. It could be some internal damage there.
Absolutely. Most of the time with the strangulation, your damage is going to be internal. You know, oftentimes with strangulation cases, a lot of times we won't see external damage depending on how the strangulation or asphyxiation was done, depending on the skin complexion. Like Diana, if we look at me, I'm much more likely to show exterior redness than if we looked at you because our complexion is different.
Right.
And so a lot of times people have injuries that we don't see. There's amazing tools that the medical community has. So we have a domestic violence sexual assault center at our hospitals, and they have a camera called the Cortex Flow, which has a special lighting system that actually illuminates bruising that's under the skin. And so when they use this specialized camera on a strangulation exam, oftentimes we see finger marks that we never saw with the naked eye, and that we can see swelling that we don't see with the naked eye. You know, there's the chance for MRIs or CT scans, depending on the issues. Because like I said, a lot of times it's internal, it's damage to arteries, to veins, to the jugular, you know, things that we're not gonna see, but we need to make sure it's checked out. Like I said, right now, only 3% of strangulation victims go and get medical attention.
Mm. Wow, that's something. That's some low numbers. That's very, very low. Okay, so we're going to move to another segment, and we're going to talk about teen dating. And before we went live, I kind of shared some things. Like I said, I don't watch everything on Lifetime. I watch some things on Lifetime that are educational, that what we need to be concerned about or what we need to be focused on if it's an interest of ours. And so we see movies, you know, the guy he met online, the girl he met online and what have you. Now, how prevalent is the teen assaults. You know, you go through so many, and you know, we just got off a case, you and I, with this other guest back here a couple of months ago and things like that. It was very sensitive, and then you know, I really didn't want to just dive into it, but you know, the father was kind of, you know, was I'm not for sure. He was blindsided and wanted to be colorblind to it, and what have you. So, how prevalent is teen dating, and when it comes to intimate partners? You know, teens have, you know, partners as well, and so they go through a lot of domestic violence. I think it's a movie that Lifetime produced where it says. She didn't tell, or he didn't tell, or no one didn't tell. It ended up very sad. It was a true movie, and she was a teenager going to high school, met this guy. They were not married, but they were partners. He was very aggressive. He went through some things himself because he did not have a live-in father. He had his mother, but he was very aggressive, angry towards her. And so she would come to school with marks. All of the friends saw it, but no one opened up their mouth and shedded you know, you need to leave him alone. I think one of the friends did, but she became aggressive. But no one told, nobody reported it, nobody intervened. So the girl she died. This is a true story. So how much of that do you see, or do we know that it's going on here in America?
So it's a lot more prevalent than you think. It's 1 in 3 when it comes to teen dating violence. And so it's everywhere. And it's when you're looking at the statistics starting at age 12. And when we look at intimate partner violence as a whole, the age group between 16 and 24 is the most dangerous, most prevalent time for intimate partner violence. But teen dating violence, 1 in 3. And February was just Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. And so I would say the One Love Foundation, it's one of my favorite foundations when it comes to teen dating violence. Their website is joinonelove.org. And that came about because of the tragic case of Yardley Love. She was a lacrosse player for University of Virginia, and she was murdered by her ex-boyfriend 3 weeks before she was to graduate from college. And, you know, as it came about, you know, family and friends were, you know, after the tragedy of Yardley losing her life, there were a lot of signs that they missed. And One Love Foundation was started by Yardley's mom in order to help other families and communities not go through what she went through. And they work on training. They have education in our schools. You can contact the One Love Foundation and get training for your schools, for teens, for faith institutions. They have an amazing video called Escalation, which every parent should watch it. Just every parent should watch it when it comes down to seeing how dating violence and teen dating violence can start with just simple things that might be like, well, that's strange, but wouldn't necessarily raise a red flag with you of, you know, the constant texting. Where are you? Who are you with? Why don't you want to spend, you know, this evening with me? All of these things being red flags. And they have, one of the things I love the best is just on their website, and it's great, especially for any teen to go to, of the 10 healthy signs of a relationship and 10 unhealthy signs of a relationship. And just making sure that our teens have the right expectation from a young age. My oldest is 11. And so I've started the conversation with him now, knowing, you know, statistically at age 12, about what you should demand respect for yourself. What does a healthy relationship look like? And more importantly, how should you treat somebody else in a healthy relationship? And so the One Love Foundation breaks that down. There's also the Cleary Center, and there's a section of that called Kristen's Crusade, which is also about a young person dating violence. And Bill Mitchell, who was a dad who lost his daughter, Kristen, from She was murdered by her boyfriend as well. And he's written a book, When Dating Hurts. And the goal of that book was also just for families and friends to be aware of the signs, because as he said, maybe if he'd known a little more or had taken steps a little bit sooner, he doesn't want any family to have to go through what he did. So we have these two amazing organizations that do so much good now, but were born out of these horrific tragedies from young people who should never have lost their life.
Mhm. So even with the case with the movie on Lifetime, why do you feel, as being a teen, let's make an adult decision as a teen young lady to reject the help? There were some that wanted, well, her best friend, she rejected her, she wanted to help, and then all of a sudden she stopped, she lost her, she stopped communicating with her best friend before she even met this guy now. She stopped communicating with him simply because of the fact that the best friend was trying to offer support to her in that area because she saw the bruises, she saw them on her thighs, she tried to cover it up with her hair, but I think she bent down one day and then, it was shown. So why do you feel that two girls would try to defend for someone that is abusing them?
Well, because most oftentimes it's not going to start with physical violence first. It's going to start with isolation. It's going to start with stalking. Stalking is huge with teen dating violence, but it's not recognized as stalking. It's often put forward of, oh, isn't he or she so romantic? They dropped in where I was working to talk to me. Oh, they put a note in my locker. Wasn't that so sweet? Like, it often comes off first because, as young people, they're just starting to feel out relationships, right? And so, some of this comes across as, I love you so much. That's why I always want to be where you are. And if you love me this much, why do you want to talk to anybody else? Why would you want to hang out with anybody else? I just want to spend time with you. You're the most important person in my life. And so it will often start with that isolating behavior, but in a way that doesn't seem abusive. That's just that beginning part. And so what happens, it's so often, and even with adults, is an abuser does isolate the victim from their family, from their friend circle. But it starts out as, it's how I show I love you, and I'm just showing you how much I love you.
Is it like a controlling mechanism though too?
Oh, it's absolutely a controlling mechanism. Isolationism is one of the number one things with that power and control dynamic, because if you can isolate them away from everybody else, you can control, or you can gaslight them. You can convince them it's their fault. If you didn't act this way, I wouldn't have to retaliate against you. Or if you could just be a better girlfriend or a boyfriend, I wouldn't get so upset.
Wow, that is something, and it starts with like a lullaby type of thing. He comes in with the lullaby, like he's really concerned. I'm here to protect you and what have you, and then it moves. So what it appears that you're saying is that it moves in different stages.
Absolutely. Very rarely, and there's always exceptions to the rule, but very rarely does intimate partner violence or dating violence start with an immediate hit or an immediate shove. It starts with other controlling dynamics first. And a lot of times emotional abuse. And think about when you are a young person, you are your most vulnerable, right? You're your most self-conscious. I'm never pretty enough. I'm never thin enough. I'm never smart enough, And these are things all of our teenagers have going on in their head. It doesn't matter if it's a boy, it doesn't matter if it's a girl. There's so much self-doubt and lack of self-worth in our teenagers, just as they're developing, they're always questioning themselves. And so if you have somebody else now who's saying the same things you already have in your head, it's easy to believe.
Okay.
So if somebody tells you, you need to lose some weight, you're a little fat, that's the voice in your head. And so you're like, yeah, you're right. And all of a sudden this person can now start to tell you what to eat or where to go. And, I don't like the way you talk. And if you didn't hang out with that friend so much, you wouldn't pick up their bad habits. And, it's picking a vulnerability and exploiting that vulnerability to get what you want. And so often abusers are master manipulators. They can pick out a vulnerability and they can exploit it to get what they want. And, you have isolationism, you have emotional abuse, you have psychological abuse, and you have, the physical abuse. And you're going to have that cycle going on.
Mhm. Okay, so I want to ask another question before we get into the last segment, which is going to be basically your courtroom arena. And so I wanted to ask a question in regards to kidnapping and holding a person hostage. What component would that fall up under? Okay, because a lot of times you have with the law enforcement, you have hostage negotiators. You have where the husband will hold the wife hostage
Mhm.
in a home or what have you, and then they will put, even though they did not take them out over state lines or what have you, but if they hold them against their will, it's still considered as kidnapping or something like that. So if you would that apply to domestic violence? And if it does, would you kind of hit on that just a little bit, if you would, on those two topics?
Absolutely, it does. Now, so there are terms of art. So kidnapping is generally in the criminal law field is going to be the movement of one person from a place to another place. And it doesn't have to cross state lines, but you do have to have the physical movement to be kidnapping. But we have false imprisonment all the time, which is keeping somebody and forcing somebody to remain in a location. And so I said they're criminal law terms of arts, the difference between kidnapping and false imprisonment, although, for the victim, it's the same outcome of being physically unable to move or leave on your own. A lot of times what we see, the situation you were describing where it's that hostage situation in the home, is going to fall under that false imprisonment. And that's absolutely a form of intimate partner violence, of maintaining them there. And oftentimes, if a survivor calls 911, it can escalate into that false imprisonment or the hostage situation. Now, it's not as prevalent as other forms. I don't want victims to be afraid to call police because it is rare, but we do see it in the news where, it's a hostage situation. We see it in the news where it's a murder suicide, where, I mean, how often do we see it where they kill the kids and the partner and then themselves? So all of that happens. We know statistically it takes a victim 7 times before they leave their abuser. That's just, the statistics when it comes down to intimate partner violence. And we know that there's fears of retaliation. We know abusers say all the time, if I can't have you, no one can. Or, the only way you're leaving this relationship is in, I've had the text message, is one of us in a body bag. And so there's an intimidation that goes along with that. And I think it's important for victims and survivors of intimate partner violence to know that there's help and there's resources. And the National Domestic Violence Hotline is a great resource. Anybody can go to their websites and they have an emergency exit button. So you can push it and it immediately goes, there's nothing saved in your history. There's no cookies. So it's a really safe way for survivors to look for help. And there's a whole section on safety planning. And because we know that a victim very rarely leaves the first time and they need help in how to leave and how to leave safely. And so you can go to, most jurisdictions have a family justice center, especially if it's a bigger population, and they can get help there, but you can get help from the National Domestic Violence Hotline on how to properly safety plan. And it has things for what papers should you start putting in your car? What should you look at finance wise? What do you need to have on place? Emergency text messages, when the pandemic started, it was going around where you could call 911 and say you're ordering a pizza and they would know, hey, I'm in an intimate partner situation and I need help, but I can't say I need help. And so I think it's important because, like I said, it's 7 times and that people know that they can get help in leaving in a safe way. So the National Domestic Violence Hotline, their phone number is 1-800-799-SAFE, or the webpage is just thehotline.org. And I think anybody who is concerned, either themselves or a loved one that is in that situation, should go look at the resources, look at proper and safe ways to get out of the situation. And 911 is always an option. It doesn't matter what form of pandemic is going on, you know, police and ambulance will always respond to provide assistance.
Mhm, mhm. So in a situation where it's a hostage situation, I'm trying to get to this last segment, but it's kind of interesting of some of the information that you're providing. So in regards to a hostage situation and a partner violation environment or what have you, why do you think that he turns and he kills himself? Is it because he has lost control because of the presence of law enforcement or someone that is there on the scene that is in more higher power than he is? Or has his ego been diffused and he just say, "Oh, you know what, I'm just gonna go ahead and kill myself because I'm not gonna win." Because a lot of times when people do stuff like that, it's a controlling issue as to the reason why they want to do the kidnapping in the house or to be able to have a hostage situation going on. It's just like it's a controlling demeanor to me.
You know, Diane, you asked the question that I and everybody in my unit struggle with every night. Why? You know, every time we have another intimate partner violence homicide, why? Why don't you just leave? Why don't you file for divorce? Why don't you just separate? You know, it doesn't have to end that way. And like I said, it's the one we struggle with every night before we go to bed. Why do I have another homicide file on my desk when it didn't need to be that way? And I don't have the answers. I wish I did. Because if I could figure that part out, you know, we could probably save a whole lot of lives. I think it's everything you mentioned. I
Okay,
think it's control. I think it's panicking. I think it is that if I can't have you, no one else can. I,
right.
all of those things play into it. But the bottom line is, I will never understand why somebody chooses to pull a trigger or strangle someone to death or stab somebody to death as opposed to just leaving the relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's kind of strange. It's something to think about. So we want to get into your actual practice as a prosecutor, special victims prosecutor. And so what are some of the statistics that you see in the courtrooms where you practice law in regards to domestic violence?
Well, you know, I think it comes down to, you know, because it's one of the things when we get new prosecutors in,
Okay.
that it can be very disheartening for them at first when they're dealing with what we call the misdemeanor courts, you know, we say simple assaults. They're not felony assaults. They don't involve weapons or strangulation. They're, you know, pushing or hitting or stomping on, and they'd fall under the misdemeanor courts. And what is very difficult, and it's difficult for law enforcement and it's difficult for new prosecutors, is when the victim says, I don't want to go forward, or I'm not going to testify against my partner. And, you know, we need to make sure they understand that whole power and control dynamic. And you need to understand that it is an average of 7 times before the victim leaves. And so you may be frustrated going, oh my goodness, you know, she stomped on him and he's bruised from head to toe, or he held a knife to her throat and put a cut. How can they be telling me they don't want to go forward and they don't want to prosecute? And part of it is understanding that's a mechanism of the abuse in and of itself.
Mm.
Maybe it's that economic abuse of they're the breadwinner, the abuser's the breadwinner. And so our victim is sitting here going, I can have a roof over the head for my children, or I can go to court.
Okay. Okay.
I can feed my children, or I can testify against my partner. Maybe it's more fear, you know, They've said if I show up to court, they'll kill me. And they've already shown that they're willing to do this.
Okay.
And so we need to recognize that there are a million different reasons why a victim does not feel they can proceed in the criminal courtroom. We need to understand that there's a million different reasons why we may have to have a not guilty, or we may have to dismiss a case. But part of that is knowing that they are seeking help. And maybe it was enough to make the 911 call this time, but not enough to go to court. But we need them to understand we're willing to fight on their behalf. We're willing to go to court for them. So maybe the next time, if they don't this time, they'll call 911 and they'll go forward. Because the most devastating thing is going to be for a victim who's already been abused in the home to then be abused by the system and to be blamed or to be yelled at for why won't you go forward? Why are you refusing to testify, and not understanding all the dynamics that can go on beyond that. But we also train all of our attorneys to prosecute a case even without a victim. If you've got the 911 call, if you have injuries of the assault, if you have a neighbor who maybe heard it or saw something, we understand the victim may not be able to speak up on their behalf, but we are going to darn sure do our job to speak for them, because we understand they may not be able to, but that's our job.
Okay. And so what's more important to you as a prosecutor in regards to a defendant? Is it more important for you to provide a plea for those that you have to prosecute, or for you to say, you know what, I need to teach you a lesson today? Because sometimes if it's the first offense, sometimes they may get it. It's the second offense, sometimes they may not get it. Sometimes it's the third offense. What levels do you go through without revealing your techniques? You don't have to do that. Do you feel that is most important for you? Is it important for you to try to get the person actually reformed so they can be able to get some kind of training or something as to the reason why they're obsessive in this type of way? Because a lot of times sometimes people have to have anger management classes. Sometimes people have to go through some classes. Some people just control it. Sometimes their fathers may have controlled them. Is it something that you consider when it comes down to pre-sentencing? As you know, you offer them a plea, or you want them to be able to see if they can be able to get enrolled in a program for help? Or do sometimes you have offenders that you can't help them? There's going to be some people you just can't help them.
So the role of a prosecutor is to seek the just result. That's it. That's our whole job, is to seek the just result.
Okay.
And that's going to differ case by case, person by person, because a just result can't be measured by a conviction. It's what's in the best interest of everybody involved and the community.
Okay.
And part of that is recognizing there's all different forms in just this arena of intimate partner violence. And so let's look at the pandemic. The pandemic added a lot of stressors into individuals' lives that weren't there before. Loss of jobs, loss of health, loss of a loved one. And so we may see individuals who have now committed acts of intimate partner violence, who had never done it before, but because of all of those outside stressors and the anxiety, they've now lost control and they've committed a form of intimate partner violence.
Mm-hmm.
In that kind of situation where we know there's now new outside stressors, that's the kind of case where we say, assuming no major injuries and no weapons involved,
Mm-hmm.
That diversion or programs is what's going to be in the best interest of everybody. Clearly, this person's in crisis who struck out and they need help. And so maybe we have batterers intervention programs. Maybe it's anger management programs. Maybe through one of our diversion programs, and we have diversion for cases, and many jurisdictions do, for misdemeanor domestic violence. You can't have any serious injuries. You can't have a history of it, but first-time offenders, non-serious injuries. And maybe it's helping them get a job and getting Job Corps, because financial stress can be a whole situation. But obviously diversion is not going to be appropriate for somebody who has a history of domestic violence. we've already tried services and that didn't work.
Okay.
So maybe now we need to sit here and say, you do need a conviction, or maybe you do need to spend some time in jail, or maybe there's another program, or maybe substance abuse is an issue. And we now need to look at an inpatient substance abuse program for you because outpatient isn't enough. And then when we're looking at other cases where, you know, I have a case that we looked at where an individual was tied up, that false imprisonment, to a chair for hours. And the boyfriend just wailed on her and took a knife and did shallow cuts, not any deep cuts, but shallow cuts all over. That was absolutely psychological torture. And it was absolutely physical abuse. And for me, I'm like, that's a prison. Like, that's not something that when you can tie somebody up and for hours commit abuse, that's not something that I'm going to be able to take care of with a batterers intervention program or an anger management program, because that's to another level. Now, we do need to consider, as part of that just result, the victim and what do they want to see happen. But we also know that so often our victims in intimate partner violence are going to say, I don't want that person to be in jail. I just want them home. And that's why when we're looking at the just result, we've got to look at what's in the community's best interest too. What do I need to show our community we're doing for healthy families to keep people safe and to make sure others don't commit those kinds of abuses? So it's going to be the broad spectrum from diversion to conviction to you've got to go away for a lot of years. And it is fact specific and it's person specific, and it's looking at the history and the outside factors that brought us to this one critical incident. And there's no bright line rule. There's no, one size fits all. It's every single case has to be looked at independently.
Okay, great. That's fair enough. So this is going to end our segment today. And Kathryn, we would like to thank you for being our guest. We would like to recap some of the topics that we discussed today on Women Who Rock Investigates. Of course, she shared multiple of tons of information in regards to stalking. We also talked about a little bit about harassment, and we talked about teen violence, teen dating and what have you. Talked about partnership, intimate partners. These topics were very, very important, and we hope that the audience is able to get what they need. And then she also shared with us numbers, links, websites that you can be able to access. If you don't even know, you still can be able to share it. If you're not in this case yourself, you still can be able to share this with someone that you may know. I even found out later on that even with certain levels of harassment, if you know about certain things of a crime, it's our duty to report it. And so if you're not going through this, you can be able to share this with someone that is going through, even in the workplace as well. So again, thank you, Kathryn, for being our first guest on Women Who Rock with Success Investigates with our video streaming. And hopefully we'll have you back on April the 1st if you don't have any court proceedings that day. So until then, we will get back with you at that time. So Women Who Rock with Success, everyone have a great day, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Diane.
Okay.